Hey everybody, it's Mr. Mazzoro, and today we're going to talk about roots. We're going to talk about roots from a number of different angles. First, we're going to talk about the dermal or outside tissue in roots and what it does for the root itself. And then we're going to talk about the differences between the way roots absorb water and nutrients. We know from the previous lesson that roots absorb water and nutrients, but do they do that the same way? Or is there a difference between the way they absorb water and the way they absorb nutrients? Then we're going to talk about the vascular tissue inside of roots and what it does for the plant and the root itself. And finally, we're going to talk about the ground tissue inside the roots and what it does for the root itself. So let's start. The dermal tissue inside roots are called root hairs. Root hairs are the way plants absorb water and nutrients. Root hairs are the only part of a plant that can absorb water and nutrients. They are these very, very fine, microscopically thin parts of the root. Now, if you think about repotting a plant, right? You repot a plant, you take it out of the pot it comes from and you put it in a new pot. What you're doing there is potentially, if you're not careful, you're disturbing or breaking all of these root hairs. And the reason why that plant might die, or when you repotted the plant it died really, really fast, is because without those root hairs, without those microscopically fine, very, very thin filaments attached to the root, that plant didn't have any way of absorbing water and nutrients, didn't have any dermal tissue, and so it died. Root hairs are the only part of a plant, the only part of the root, that can absorb water and nutrients from the ground. But how does that happen? Well, they absorb water passively. Water moves via passive transport into the root. That means it moves from a higher concentration to a lower concentration without taking energy. There's usually more water in the ground than there is in the root, and so water will naturally move into the root. But unfortunately, during a drought or when a pot dries out, there's more water in the plant than the root than the pot itself in the dirt. And so what happens there is water moves out of the plant. The plant dehydrates and it could dry. And that's one of the reasons why you need to water plants a lot, especially in pots that dry out very fast, because plants move water in and out of themselves passively. They don't have any control of it. Water's just going to go to wherever there's less of it. Usually, hopefully, there's less water in the plant than the soil, and so it's going to go in. Sometimes that's not true, and water's going to go out. Nutrients move in actively, from low concentration to high concentration. Plants will expend energy to suck in as much nutrients to the soil, regardless of the fact that there's usually less nutrients in the soil than in the plant itself, against its concentration gradient. So, here's root hairs, right, on a root, and we're going to put some Miracle-Gro, or nutrients, in the soil. There's 1, 2, 3 Miracle-Gros outside the soil. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 Miracle-Gros inside the soil. Now, Miracle-Gros are nutrients, so nutrients move in actively. That means they don't go from high to low, which in this case would be out of the plant. Instead, they're going to go always in. Nutrients move in actively. The plant literally expends energy to suck those nutrients into the plant roots itself, regardless of the fact that there's plenty of them already in the plant. All that nutrients in the root means that usually there's less water inside than outside. And in this case, because there's less water inside the root than outside the root, water is going to move in passively. Now, this animation is wrong, because you'll notice that water is moving in until there's tons of water inside the root and there's no water outside the root. Really what would happen is water would move in until there's an equal amount inside and outside. But you get the idea. Nutrients always move in regardless of how much there is in or out. Water will move always from high to low. Hopefully there's a low inside the plant and a high outside, in which case water moves in. Sometimes there's a high inside the plant and a low outside, in which case the plant will dehydrate. So look at this. Inside a plant root, a carrot, there's 90% water. Outside, there's 10. Where's the high? Inside. Here, low, outside. So water is going to move out of the root from high to low. Water moves out. So right here in your notes, write out. Nutrients. The high is outside, low is inside, but that doesn't matter because nutrients will always move in, regardless of the numbers. So right here under beaker A in your notes, write in. Here's beaker B, a different scenario. Here we have water equal concentrations outside and inside. In this case, water won't move anywhere. Water moves passively. Plants don't expend any energy moving water. So it moves in and out freely. It doesn't move at all. However you want to say that here. I don't know. In terms of nutrients, again, nutrients are transported actively. Plants use energy to suck them in. So regardless of the fact that they're even inside and outside, nutrients will always move in. So nutrients will move in. In your notes under beaker C, you have a slightly different scenario. Here, high for water is inside, the low 25 outside. So water in this case will move from high to low, and again, unfortunately, it'll move out of the root. So under beaker C in this spot, water moves out because it's higher in the root than outside, high to low. Again, and you don't even have to worry about the numbers. Why? Active transport for nutrients, right? So nutrients always move what? In. Does it even matter? No. 75, 25, I don't care. Water nutrients are going to move in because nutrients are transported actively. Plants use energy to do that. They don't use any energy to transport water inside themselves, which means water is always going to move from high to low. Last, vascular and ground tissue in the roots. Roots have vascular tissue. It's xylem and phloem. It's actually in the center of the root. Now, I know what you're thinking. Why isn't vascular tissue in the root hairs? Well, remember what I said in the last lesson. Vascular tissue doesn't absorb water and nutrients. It just moves it. Root hairs are the dermal tissue in roots. They absorb water and nutrients. They have nothing to do with moving it. They just absorb it. Once that water and nutrients is absorbed, it's going to get transported to the xylem and phloem where it can, if your water, flow up to the leaves, or if your sugar store or nutrients store in the root or flow up to the leaves, whatever you need. That xylem and phloem is in the very, very center of the roots, and it helps transport the water and nutrients, not that they absorb, but that the root hairs, the dermal tissue, absorbs. Lastly, we also have ground tissue in the roots. Here's a picture of root ground tissue, and you'll notice here's all these cells, and you'll notice, yeah, these little things right here, that looks like a nucleus, but that's not the nucleus. That's actually all the organelles inside a plant cell, other than this big white vacuole that's around the outside. So you have everything, nucleus, endoplasmic reticula, ribosomes, everything in this little area right here, and this one big area here is one gigantic vacuole. And you'll also notice that the distance between these cells is very small, that the cell walls of roots are very, very thin. The structure of root ground tissue is thin cell walls and very large vacuoles. Why? Because ground tissue in the roots absorbs and stores water and nutrients. So it needs thin cell walls to help absorb that water and nutrients into the cell. A thick cell wall would stop the water and nutrients from getting into the cell. That large vacuole helps store the water and nutrients once it's inside the cell. So, dermal tissue in the roots, root hairs, what do? Those are the things that absorb water and nutrients. How do they absorb water? Passively, without using energy. Hopefully that means higher outside the root than inside the root, the water is going to move in. But in a drought, in low water, that means that water is going to move from the root into the soil. and dehydrate the plant, and potentially the plant's going to wither and die. How do plants absorb nutrients? Actively, using energy against their concentration gradient if they need to. Nutrients are always going to be sucked into the plant no matter how much there is inside the plant already. What is vascular tissue inside the roots? Xylem and phloem. What does it do? Moves water and nutrients, not absorbs it. Absorbing it is what the dermal tissue does. Xylem and phloem moves the water and nutrients once the dermal tissue has absorbed it, either up to the root, up to the stem, or up to the leaves, whatever needs to happen. Last, the ground tissue inside the roots has large cell walls, has large vacuoles and thin cell walls. Why? So those large vacuoles can store water and nutrients, and that water and nutrients can be transported into and out of those cell ground tissue easily via the thin cell walls. And that's it for roots, and the next lesson we'll talk about stems.